Okay, so you see a headline like this, and you kind of have to rub your eyes and check it twice,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The Dow jumps over 2,000 points in a day.
It does grab your attention.
That's not your average Tuesday, you know?
Definitely not something you see every day.
And what's really wild is that it seems like all of this was set off by, President Trump and this kind of unexpected announcement about tariffs.
Yeah, it's really fascinating.
Almost like someone hit fast forward on the market.
Exactly. And you know what's really interesting about a market reaction of that size, I think, is what it tells us about like all the anxiety that's kind of bubbling under the surface,
Right.
That kind of jump suggests a pretty big shift in how people are viewing the, all the risks around global trade. And it seems like this one announcement really was the trigger.
Absolutely. And that's exactly why we're diving deep into this today. You've gathered a bunch of sources for us, news reports, official statements, all that stuff. And what we really want to do is get under the hood of this announcement. What was actually said? What's the strategy behind this sudden move? And at the end of the day, what does it all mean for the global economy?
Yeah.
We want to give everyone listening the clarity they need without getting bogged down in all the constant stream of headlines.
Absolutely, because at the end of the day, these aren't just, abstract numbers.
Right.
These shifts have real-world implications.
Yeah.
They affect everything from, international relations to the prices you see when you go to the grocery store.
Yeah.
So let's break down what actually sparked this huge reaction.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. It seems like this whole thing kicked off with a Truth Social post from President Trump. So what were the main points? What did he actually announce?
So the announcement had two big parts, and both of them took effect immediately.
Okay.
The first part was President Trump declaring a 90-day pause on what he called reciprocal tariffs.
Okay.
And this pause applies to most countries, but specifically the ones that didn't retaliate against the U.S. when the U.S. first put tariffs on them. So you can kind of think of reciprocal tariffs, like if one country puts a tariff on another country and that second country says, well, fine, we're going to put a tariff on you too. That's the reciprocal part.
Right, tit for tat, yeah.
Exactly. So basically he's hitting the pause button for the countries that didn't hit back.
Okay, so that's one side of it. A temporary truce with some countries. What was the other part of the announcement?
So at the same time, he announced a big increase in tariffs on goods coming in from China. These tariffs jumped to 125%. Which is a pretty significant hike from the 104% that had just gone into effect.
Wow.
So basically, most countries got a break, but the pressure on China just got a whole lot stronger.
So it's like a tale of two approaches, right? A step back from conflict with most countries, but then a big escalation with China. And all of this happened right away.
Exactly. It was immediate. And I think that immediacy is a big part of why the market reacted so strongly and so quickly. It sent a really clear signal that things were changing and changing right now.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so let's try to understand the reasoning here.
Yeah.
What's the logic behind this 90-day pause for most countries? Why this sudden shift to a more, friendly approach?
Well, it's interesting. The explanation that's being given is that the White House was basically flooded with calls from other countries, apparently more than 75 countries, all saying they wanted to work out better trade deals with the U.S.
Wow.
And the story is that these countries listened to what President Trump had said earlier about not retaliating, and they held off on putting their own tariffs in place.
So they're being rewarded for playing along? Is that?
That's basically how it's being framed. It's like a chance for these countries to come to the table and negotiate what they're calling bespoke negotiations.
Bespoke negotiations. What does that even mean?
It basically means individually tailored trade deals. Each country gets its own specific deal. And President Trump has reportedly said he wants to be personally involved in these discussions. His goal is to get what he considers to be fair deals because he believes that other countries have been taking advantage of the U.S. economically.
So he sees this as a way to kind of right the ship to make things more balanced?
Right. And the Treasury Secretary also chimed in on this, emphasizing the strategic side of this pause.
What do they say?
Well, they said that this whole move is about creating maximum negotiating leverage. So they're using this 90-day window as a way to sort of kickstart all these different negotiations that they're expecting to happen.
Okay, so that's the reasoning for the pause, an incentive and a chance to make individual deals. Now let's turn to China. What's the explanation for this big tariff hike on their imports?
So according to the sources, the increase on Chinese tariffs is because of what's being seen as a lack of respect for global markets from China.
Okay.
And probably even more importantly, their decision to retaliate when the U.S. put those initial tariffs on them.
Yeah, they hit back pretty hard.
They did. They put their own tariffs on American imports, something like 84%.
Wow.
And the U.S. is saying that China has the most imbalanced economy in the history of the modern world, and that they're the main source of trade problems for the U.S.
So they're being painted as the bad guy here, the one who's not willing to play ball.
Yeah, that's the narrative that's being presented. The U.S. is saying that China's retaliation is basically escalating the situation.
Right.
So this tariff hike is a direct response to what they see as China's unwillingness to negotiate in good faith.
It's a pretty clear message.
It definitely is.
Okay, so we have this divergence in tactics, a carrot for most of the world and a big stick for China. And then we see this huge reaction from the market. The Dow jumps over 2,000 points.
Yeah.
What do you think caused such a dramatic response?
Well, when you see a jump that big, it usually means that investors are feeling a lot more optimistic. Their sentiment has shifted.
Right.
And in this case, I think the announcement of a pause in tariffs probably calmed down some of those immediate fears about a trade war getting out of control, you know?
Like a sigh of relief.
Yeah, exactly. Especially for industries that are really sensitive to trade, like manufacturing and technology, those probably saw some big gains. And you also have to remember that markets really don't like uncertainty.
Makes them nervous.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So even though this announcement is kind of complicated, it might have provided a little bit more clarity, even if it's just temporary.
So they're thinking, okay, maybe things aren't going to completely blow up right away, at least not for the next 90 days.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that some analysts are saying, hey, hold on a second, this doesn't really solve the underlying problems in trade or give us any long-term certainty about U.S. policy. A pause isn't a peace treaty.
That's a really good point. A temporary break isn't a solution.
Mm-hmm.
So how did other countries react to all of this? You mentioned that we had some initial responses from around the world. What did they say?
Well, the European Union announced that they were going to put their own countermeasures on hold for the same 90 days, which means they were planning to put tariffs on about 21 billion euros worth of U.S. imports. But they're going to wait and see what happens with these negotiations.
So they're giving it a chance.
Right, but they also made it very clear that they'll put those tariffs back in place if they don't like how the negotiations go.
So they're being cautious, but they're not backing down.
Yeah, they're keeping their options open. What about China? How did they react, especially with these increased tariffs aimed right at them?
Yeah, what did they say?
Well, as you might expect, China's response was pretty strong. They said that they completely reject what the U.S. is doing, and they called it threats and blackmail.
Wow.
A spokesperson for their commerce ministry said that China would follow through to the end if the U.S. keeps going down this path.
So they're not backing down either.
Nope. But they did say that they're still open to talking, but only if it's based on mutual respect and equality.
So it's a bit of a mixed message, right? They're standing their ground, but they're not closing the door completely.
Yeah, it's a very delicate situation. It seems like some other countries saw this as an opportunity, though, a chance to strengthen their relationship with the U.S.
Yeah, like who?
Well, India, for example, they've reportedly expressed interest in speeding up talks for a trade deal with the U.S. They seem to think this might be a good time to improve their economic ties.
So we've got a whole spectrum of reactions.
Mm-hmm.
Some countries are relieved, some are pushing back, and some see an opening. So even with this pause, for most countries, it sounds like there's still a lot of question marks and potential problems. What are some of the big unknowns here?
Well, there are definitely some things that haven't been resolved. For one, the 10% tariff that applies to most U.S. imports is still in effect.
Oh, right. So that didn't go away.
Nope. And the tariffs on specific industries like cars, steel, and aluminum, those are also still in place.
So it's not a clean slate.
No. And then there's the issue of tariffs related to fentanyl on goods coming from Canada and Mexico, which could still be put in place if those countries don't meet the rules set out in the USMCA trade agreement.
So this pause is really targeted. It's not a complete overhaul of the whole tariff system.
Exactly. And some analysts are even questioning whether it's even realistic to try to negotiate with more than 75 countries in just 90 days.
That does seem like a lot to squeeze in.
It does, especially because the U.S. hasn't really said what they want from each country, what their goals are for each negotiation.
Right. It's all very vague.
And then there's the bigger question of whether the U.S. even has a clear long-term trade strategy. What's the plan beyond this 90 days?
Well, what happens after the pause?
Exactly. And of course, there's still the worry about the economy, beyond that initial bump in the market. Are there still risks?
Good question.
Well, some people are still concerned about inflation because a lot of those tariffs are still in place.
Right.
And it's interesting because even though the market was initially optimistic, oil prices actually went down. And some analysts think that's because they're worried about this trade war with China getting worse and maybe even causing a global recession.
Wow. So even with the good news, there's still this underlying fear.
There is, and we also saw the Chinese yuan weaken against the dollar. It hit its lowest point since the financial crisis, which could have its own set of consequences.
So it sounds like a very complicated situation. There was this initial wave of relief, but there's still a lot of uncertainty and potential problems.
Exactly. The market reacted positively to the pause, but the long-term effects and what actually happens with these negotiations, it's all still very much up in the air.
All right, so let's sum this all up for our listeners. What are the key takeaways from this whole tariff saga?
I think the most important things to remember are that President Trump announced this surprising 90-day pause on new tariffs for most countries, but at the same time, he increased tariffs on China. And we saw a big positive reaction from the global markets, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. And then you have these very different reactions from countries around the world. Some are happy, some are angry, and some see this as an opportunity.
It's a real mixed bag.
It is. And for you, the listener, the immediate impact might be things like changes in the stock market or maybe even price changes for some goods. But over the next 3 months, it's going to be really important to keep an eye on how these bespoke trade negotiations are going and how the relationship between the U.S. and China develops.
So much to watch.
Yeah, a lot can happen in 90 days.
Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into this tariff news, here's a final thought for you to consider. Is this unexpected change a real shift in strategy? Is the U.S. changing its approach to global trade? Or is it more of a short-term tactic, maybe driven by pressure from the markets, with the possibility of even more unexpected moves in the future? And what could happen if the U.S. isolates China economically while trying to make separate deals with all these other countries? It's definitely something to think about as we see how this all plays out.
A lot of big questions to ponder.
Definitely.
Really makes you think.
Thanks for breaking it all down.
Absolutely, anytime.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll be back soon with more analysis on the latest events shaping our world.
See you next time.
Bye for now.